I speak and we all hear by the grace of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. A couple of weeks ago, we had a small Lenten retreat with a few people from the parish up at Graymore. And while I was there, one of the things that I noticed was that part of the motto of the Friars of the Atonement who run Graymore is the Latin phrase, ut unum sint, which means that they all may be one. It comes from the prayer that Jesus prayed in the Gospel of John just before he was arrested. And it struck me as a little odd, considering that in fact the order that the Friars of the Atonement, the order that runs the place, began as an Episcopal order and then left the Episcopal Church to become Roman Catholic. Specifically, the reason why they left, we got interested in this issue while we were sitting around talking at the retreat, and we had to look it up. They left principally over something that was called the Open Pulpit Resolution. At the 1907 General Convention of the Episcopal Church, there was a resolution passed that said that although a parish was not permitted to call anyone to serve as a priest or a deacon in a parish who had not been ordained according to the normal Anglican process, they were in fact allowed, permitted, to invite people from other Christian denominations to come and preach. And the concern among those who left in this group was that that would lead to unorthodox doctrine being preached from Episcopal pulpits, and they could not agree with that, and so they went to Rome. It seems a little ironic, then, that the Friars of the Atonement have made a particular point in the rest of their history since then of working toward Christian unity. One is moved to wonder in more cynical moments exactly what they mean by Christian unity when they say that. But I don't mean to beat up particularly on the Friars of the Atonement. I just want to use that as a very good example of the eternal truth that if you want a really good fight, there's nothing like family. That's what we walk into in the gospel this morning. Jesus and the Samaritan woman are in the middle of a family feud. And it's worth unpacking a little bit what's going on in that story to see where the gospel is taking us. For that, we need to have a little more ancient history. Israel was kind of like a skinny supermodel sitting between two 350-pound defensive backs in the middle seat on an airplane. There are these two huge guys who are angry all the time. One is usually Egypt, the other is sometimes Assyria, sometimes Babylon, some big country. They tended to fight with each other. They thought the person sitting between them was pretty interesting because Israel was an important real estate between these two places. So they were fighting over Israel, they were fighting with Israel, they were fighting in Israel. Israel, in the meantime, was trying to make the best deal it could by sometimes allying with one side and sometimes with the other. Well, at one point, Israel decided to throw in its lot with Egypt against Babylon, not realizing that that wasn't going to work out so well. And in fact, Babylon came over and conquered both Israel and Egypt while they were at it. And then, to make sure that Israel couldn't do this to them again, they carted off all the most educated, the wealthiest, the leaders of the society back to Babylon so that Israel wouldn't have any leadership. But what you don't think about when you hear that is when you read this story in the Bible, when you hear about it in Jewish history since, it's being told from the perspective of the doctors and lawyers and such who got carted off to Babylon. Remember that there were a lot of other people in Israel. Farmers, fishermen, peasants, little craftsmen people. Babylon had plenty of them of its own. It didn't need to import any from Israel. It had more than enough poor people to begin with. So it left most of those poor people where they were. They had to keep on with their religion. Babylon had destroyed the temple. The worship in Jerusalem was gone. Most of the priests were gone. But they still had the Torah. And they still had their religious life, so they carried on. They built a new temple at a place called Mount Gerizim, which is in the West Bank in Palestine. And they continued to copy the Torah and read it. And the people in Babylon did the same thing. They kept reading the Torah and interpreting it and so on. But like people who were doing the same thing in two different places, gradually little changes came into each one that the other one didn't know about. It's like going to Montreal now and trying to speak French to people. Yes, they still speak French, but it's not exactly what you would hear in Paris anymore. Well, eventually, those Babylonian people were permitted to come back to Israel. They came back thinking that they had the real message. They had the right way of doing Judaism. Those people who had stayed in Israel when the others left thought they had the right way of doing Judaism. And so, as would be typical whenever we have this sort of religious family fight, they decided the proper answer was not to discuss it, but to be completely separate, not to talk to those people, not even to think about those people. And just to make sure that each side understood how this worked, they also said, well, if you go having to do with those people, then you can't be part of us anymore. You'll be unclean. If you even touch one of those people, you can't do what we do over here anymore. This should sound vaguely familiar to us as American Christians in a society where the loudest Christian voices seem to know exactly what the right answer is, and to tell us that anyone who doesn't do it exactly the way they do it is not really one of them. You're one of those other people. You're not one of us. And so this is where this story begins this morning. You can imagine the Samaritan woman's surprise when Jesus, who was plainly an Orthodox Jewish man in the mainstream of Judaism, which he was, doesn't just notice that she exists, which is unusual enough. Not only is she a Samaritan, but she's a woman, which compounds the difficulty between them. He asked her for a drink. He's going to eat with her. I mean, you didn't talk to Samaritans, you didn't eat with them, you didn't do business with them, you didn't touch them, you didn't admit that they existed. And here he is asking her to give him a drink. And then he takes an interest in her. He asks about her personal life in an indirect sort of way. So you can imagine she was pretty surprised when this happened. But at the same time, it's like every time when anyone we don't know and we kind of think of as being one of them takes an interest in us. It's a little bit flattering, it's a little bit scary. We kind of want it to happen. We kind of want to see where it's going to go, and it makes us open up and say things we wouldn't otherwise. I have my own personal example of this. Soon after I was ordained, when I was still living in New Haven, I knew I was coming to New York, but I didn't know what I was going to do for the church once I got here. And so at one point I was summoned down to the headquarters of the Diocese of New York to talk about what I was going to do once I got here. So I put on my collar all nervously because I was a brand new deacon and it was all very new to me. And I got on the train to go down to Manhattan. Now I should confess to you that in any moving conveyance of any kind, trains, planes, automobiles, buses, horse wagons, if I'm not driving it, I sit down and I fall asleep. Instantly. So I got on the train in New Haven and I was asleep before we got to Milford. The car was pretty empty when I got on, but by the time I woke up after, say, Bridgeport, it had filled up. Not only was it not empty, there were two people sitting right next to me in my three-person seat. And immediately next to me was a young lady who, by her clothing and her multiple piercings, I would inwardly immediately have said is not one of us. Now, I would like to think that I awoke gracefully, but again, based on prior experience, I probably snorted back into life. And so she knew that I was awake. And after a couple minutes of shy silence, she turned to me and said, "Are you a priest?" Not wanting to get into the details of exactly what stages of ordination are, I said yes. And inwardly thought to myself, well, here we go. It's going to be a story about ill treatment at the hands of the church. What am I going to hear next? But I was surprised. I was wrong. What followed was a gentle, lovely conversation about her journey of faith and mine. She had been brought up in a religious household, but like many of her generation, she said she was spiritual but not religious. That didn't mean she wasn't asking the questions, the big questions. And so we talked about her journey toward what she understood to be God or understood to be a life of faith. And we talked about mine, how I had gotten to where I was. And we only really stopped when we got to Grand Central and had to go our separate ways. And so it reminded me that in these situations, we want to know and be known. And if we're willing to be just a little bit risky, if we're willing to step out there and say, yes, I am, whatever that question may be, are you a fill in the blank, there is the possibility that it won't turn out to be some terrible situation of recrimination and reproach, but rather a chance to discover the other and to be discovered in some way that expands our understanding of ourselves. Now that's great, pop psychology. If I could write that into a book, I could get on Oprah and I would never have to work again. It's a little different when we take out the other being a person and put in the other being God. When we come to talk about knowing and being known by God, we get a little bit more nervous around the edges about how that's going to work. I will confess that there are parts of myself I don't like very much. And for at least part of the time, I would like to think that God isn't paying too much attention to me. If God doesn't notice, then maybe it'll all be okay. But the story of the gospel, the story of the Bible as a whole, is that God does notice and comes looking for us anyway. Jesus is being a lawyer in this story. You know, lawyers only ask questions that they already know the answer to. He asks this woman, go and bring your husband, already knowing what the answer is going to be. And the woman, trusting for whatever reason, answers in faith and has a profound experience of contact with God. She believes that Jesus is the Messiah when he tells her that. Now, this is God being sly. Think about this situation. If God had come down to this woman by the well as a thundercloud and the voice of damnation, you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now you are living with in sin, that would have been pretty much the end of the conversation. The woman would have said, it's just another Jewish guy telling me what they all tell me. She would have taken her jar and gone away and had no contact with God in that experience. Jesus asks her a sly question. Can I have a drink? And by asking her the question she wasn't expecting, draws her into this experience that otherwise she would not have had. So part of the good news this morning, brothers and sisters, is that God knows our nature. God knows all those parts of us that we wish God didn't know about, and comes looking for us anyway.